Please be seated. One of the things that delights me most about spending time with children is that they're passionate about what they delight in. If they have a favorite story, they read it over and over. If they have a favorite show, they get all the toys, and that's all they can talk about. My nephew, Wallace, when he was not fully convinced that potty training was a good idea, would bring me the picture book, Diapers Are Not Forever, 5 times a day, and we would read it. My niece did the same thing with another book called Bye Bye Time, when she wasn't convinced that she should be left at preschool every day. When I found out that I was preaching half an hour before our first service, this is the story I reminded myself of. In self-compassion, I reminded myself that we can hear things more than once. And so that is a way to tell you that about 75% of what is to follow has been preached by me in this pulpit 3 years ago. Today's passage that Deacon Lowell just read is really hard. It's hard to hear. It's hard to read. It's hard to make sense of in today's world. And I think our number one responsibility when hearing it is to name that hardness and to notice how it impacts us and hold that in this space as a faith community. I would venture that most of us here, if not all of us, have heard it with personal experiences that hurt or that have been painful, whether they be personal experiences of divorce and judgment, hard experiences over the debate of the definition of marriage, or painful experiences over the debate of gender. I personally am married to a man who was divorced, and I hear it with that lens. I worry that in preaching this passage, that I can remind all of us of that pain and inadvertently hurt more. Here's what I worry about even more, though, is not preaching this passage. I worry that by remaining silent, ignoring what was said, I promote past interpretations that wound, past interpretations that do not respect the dignity of every human being here. And I worry about tacitly agreeing to ignore the parts of our sacred stories that are hard and take a lot of vulnerable courage to engage. Because as we all know, living life is hard. We all know that even if we have a deep faith, even if Jesus feels like he is by our side all the time, sometimes life is hard. And we don't get to skip those parts. We have to learn to wade through them with our doubts and imperfections. We have to learn to engage them together, listening deeply, trusting in, maybe even challenging God's love and grace. And when we see others in pain, sometimes all we can do is listen, be present, and say, this is really hard. I'm here. I get it. Let's muddle through it together. So here we muddle through Mark. We have been following Jesus and his disciples to Jerusalem for almost a year now. We have been following them to Jesus' cross, and his disciples still don't get it. Every step of the way, Jesus has been ministering to those who are vulnerable and without power. Jesus has been ministering to those who have need and dependency. The Pharisees enter in today's scene. They represent worldly power. They are the in crowd. And they love asking Jesus loaded questions. Today's question is it lawful for a man to get a divorce? Jesus, in good form, and I imagine with feistiness, responds with a question. What did Moses say? According to Moses, it was lawful to divorce. And according to Roman law at the time, divorce was lawful for men. Jesus and the Pharisees both knew this when they asked the question. I venture it's not about the question. And for our common understanding, marriage at the time was not yet considered a sacrament. A sacrament is an outward sign of an inward and spiritual grace. Marriage was not about love and companionship, but about how society was structured and functioned. After the Pharisees respond, Jesus continues that God created man and woman as ideal partners, and we shouldn't separate that. Then Jesus retreats with his followers into a house, and the disciples ask the common question of Mark, what? They didn't know exactly what Jesus meant. Scholars today don't know exactly what Jesus means by these words. The Bible is not of one voice around the definition of marriage. We cannot hold up today's verse as the ultimate truth without looking at all of the sacred stories. In much of the Old Testament, the patriarchs have many wives. That is not a standard we hold up today. In Jesus' own stories, there are tensions. One of my favorite conversations Jesus has is with the woman at the well. She had 5 husbands, as is pointed out in that story, and was currently living with someone she wasn't married to. This is one of the longest conversations that Jesus has with someone, and she walks away a true evangelist, a follower. Jesus also publicly defends and forgives the woman caught in adultery, whose name we never learn. We hear another voice through Paul in his epistles. He articulates a low view of marriage, basically writing that marriage is something you do if you're too weak to be celibate. Matthew's version of today's passage has a similar tone to Paul. Matthew tacks on a part that implies only get married if you must. What I hear in all of these voices of diversity is that our view of marriage as followers of the way of Jesus has developed and changed as we follow what God is doing in the world. We know that God is moving here and now, and we must respond to that for all things. This was true of Jesus' time, too. If this wasn't enough of the gospel to take in, we add on the children. The disciples are attempting to prevent little children from reaching Jesus. Jesus welcomes them into his arms, blesses them, and says we must be like them to enter the kingdom of God. We're left asking, why are these two passages together? I venture that Jesus is once again flipping the world as his disciples know it on its head. As true of all of his stories, Jesus is challenging the structures of injustice and inequality. Women and children were vulnerable members of society. Women depended on their husbands for financial and social well-being. And this was in a culture in which adultery was only seen as a crime women could commit against their husbands, or husbands could commit against other husbands. Divorce left women without a home and without an income. Jesus' answers provided protection and marriage equality to women within his culture, more protection than the social norms at the time had. The Pharisees were not asking if everyone could get divorced. They were specifically asking if men could get divorced. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, children were not the treasured, adorable part of society that they are today. They were seen as completely dependent users of resources until they could contribute. They too were in a low position in society, and they too had access to Jesus. These passages portray Jesus' love extended to two vulnerable parts of the population at the time. Imagining this in our context today, I hear an acknowledgement that broken relationships are painful. Even if breaking them is the most life-giving option, even if breaking them is necessary for life, there is still pain. And we need to tend to that pain when we walk with others. I hear that we too need to find ways to care for and elevate those with the least amount of power and agency in our own society. In this passage, there is life-giving truth that children and women, that outsiders have an important place in God's kingdom. We too, whether unmarried, married, divorced, childless, remarried, male, non-binary, female, however we describe ourselves, we have all been outsiders in some capacity. We too can find our place in God's kingdom. God's kingdom is for all of us. It is for you. It is for me. This is the part of the sacred story that I am reminding myself of every day, that I'm sometimes telling myself up to 5 times every day, or even more than Wallace. God's kingdom is for you. God's kingdom is for me. God's kingdom is for all of us. This is where my hope lies.